Title: What Vikings Did to Prisoners Was Worse Than You Think. The first sound is not steel, not shouting. It's the soft hiss of oars slipping through a slate blue sea, and the gulls that have not yet learned to be afraid. On the horizon, long hulls rise and fall like the ribs of a sea creature, their prows carved into snarling beasts that seem to breathe in the cold morning air. The men aboard are quiet, not because they're gentle, but because they've done this before. They can smell the shore. They can smell the smoke of fires that have no idea yet that their purpose is about to change. When we think of the Vikings, we instinctively reach for thunder and spectacle, axes smashing shields, burning roofs collapsing into themselves, the cartoonish image of horned helmets that they never wore. We imagine quick deaths and vivid murders, but the truth that slid with those oars toward unsuspecting coasts was colder, steadier, and far more disturbing. It was not only a story of killing, it was a system of taking, patience, careful, calculating, that turned human lives into currency and turned fear into a climate. What they did to prisoners wasn't simply violent. It was efficient, it was intimate, and it was often meant to be seen. Lindisfarne had been there since before the raiders were born. A small island like a drop of green ink in the North Sea, its monastery rising out of the surf like a promise of peace in a hard world. The monks who lived there knew tides, scriptures, and the cold ache of simple hunger. But they didn't know war. Not really. Not the way the men riding those ships had learned it along fjords and forests, raiding since they were big enough to hold a shield. The boats kissed the shore with almost a lover's care. Wet boots in the shallows. Men lift shields out of the boats as if they are lifting a table to a feast. The first shouting is not Viking. It's someone on the island who sees them and tries to make sense of it. There isn't time. Doors splinter. A bell rings, then falls silent. Some of the monks try to hide the silver. That part of the story gets told again and again. But the raiders know where treasure lives. They always know. They also know treasure breeds. It's not just the little chalices and gilded pages. It's the hands that wrote them, the heads that know how to read, the young ones whose backs are strong, the old ones maybe not. The raiders choose quickly. One monk with ink still wet on his fingertips is struck, not killed, just stunned, because he's a body that can carry weight and a name that can summon ransom. Another man raises a cross like a shield. It doesn't help. The Vikings aren't blind to holiness. They are immune to it. People love to say this was the first, 793, the start of the Viking Age. But it wasn't the first time anyone had stolen a person from their home. It wasn't even the first time these men had seized captives. It was, however, the first time that this particular mix of speed, surprise, and symbol spilled into the Christian chronicle with enough force to change how the North was imagined. And prisoners were at the heart of it all. Monks, farmers, fishermen, brides on their way to market, boys who hadn't yet grown into their father's shoes. The Vikings sorted them as calmly as they might sort plunder: ransom, use, sell. Some were kept for a season, some for a journey, some for the rest of their lives. The longboats don't stay long. They never do. The men don't want a pitched fight. They want a wound that keeps bleeding, a community that will pay to stop the pain, again and again. Those who can bring silver are bundled, pushed, tied with cords that bite into skin. Those who aren't useful enough to live are left where they fell, or, if someone in the raiding party wants to be clever, a few bodies are arranged with terrible care, so that when others come to find them, they see a message no axe could carve. This is what your gods cannot prevent. On deck, the sea is indifferent. It will carry home whatever men put on it: fish, timber, stories, people. The captives taste salt on their lips. They vomit when the boat climbs the back of a wave like a horse and then plunges. They are given water when it suits their captors, not when their throats burn. They're fed enough to keep them walking when the shore returns. Archaeologists digging centuries later at fortresses like Trelleborg and at harbors like Hedeby find iron collars and manacles, simple rings that open and close with quiet authority. They find sockets on ship beams that could take a bar to chain people in place. They find stains of coin in soil, silver dirhams from lands so far away that the monks of Lindisfarne didn't have a word for them. The quiet wealth of those coins tells its own story. Human beings were a commodity on these boats. One system was ransom, practiced with the same ritual clarity as any religious service. A chief might send back a tongue, a finger, a strand of hair as proof of possession and as a gentle push toward payment. The right captive, an abbot, an earl's son, was a lever you could pull on an entire community, a way to force someone far away to arrange for a pile of silver and a sack of bitter pride. Cities along the coasts learned the ritual too. Hard men with hard eyes became negotiators overnight, counting coins with hands that still shook from battle. Another system was the market. Henneby hums in the mind the way a wasp nest hums in a hedge, dangerous, dense, industrious. Ships from the Baltic and the Frankish rivers packed into a harbor where the water itself seemed to have learned to trade. Dublin wasn't just a raider's nest. It was a warehouse for sorrow, one of the largest slave markets in the Western world during some of those years. Burka, Kalpang, Staraya Ladoga, names that don't mean much to a monk with a hood pulled over his shorn head, but names that mattered to the men in whose hands his life had become a line item. In the sagas and in scraps of law, we see them labeled thralls, living property, their value written in numbers and in the right to beat them. In the reports of Arab travelers who met the Rus, those riverine cousins of the Vikings who rowed their longboats across the veins of Eastern Europe, there's mention of the slave girls they sold, the chains, the markets. The dirhams tell the rest as they pile up, stamped with Kufic script, soft with use. But not every prisoner waited in a pen to be sold. Some waited in a different marketplace, one of honor and danger. A captive with skills might be kept and bent to a new household. A carpenter with good hands could be set to shaping timber for a haul that would outlast him. A singer, if he had the right poems in his throat, might find that his chains were lighter than he feared, even as they still marked him. And women, many women, were taken into houses not as servants, but as solutions to desire and inheritance. In the laws that survived from places like Iceland and Norway, a thrall woman could bear children whose status was written by the father's will or lack of it. The cruelty here was not always a raised fist. It was the constant presence of ownership. It was waking up every day knowing that someone else had not only taken your place in the world, they'd taken your name and put it aside like a broken cup they hadn't decided whether to throw away yet. The Vikings were not unique in enslaving, in ransoming, in using hostages to coax or coerce. What made their machines of captivity feel different to those who suffered them was the mixture of theater and frankness. In a mead hall in the dark, a chief might stand and boast, in the coded, musical way of skaldic poetry, about the men he had hung on a windy tree for Odin. He might invoke old rites that the Christian writers were quick to call barbaric, and that the archaeological record sometimes, only sometimes, whispers about. In bogs, bodies have been found that show signs of deliberate killing, deposits that match the logic of sacrifice. At Uppsala, a great temple that lived more in report than in stone, a German chronicler wrote of men hanging among slaughtered beasts in a sacred grove, their deaths part of a festival where gods were hungry and kings were priests. How many of those hanging bodies were prisoners? How many were war captives offered to make a victory complete? The sagas and chronicles do not always agree. But captives were raw material for meaning as much as for labor, and the men who took them knew that. This is where the story starts to feel worse than it looks at first glance. Not because the deaths were always bloodier, though some were, but because the point of taking was so often to use a person up, in more ways than one. Control completely, and you do not need to kill. Mark someone, and they will carry your will for you. Archaeologists have found iron collars with rings that make it easy to attach a chain and easy to spot a runaway. In some laws, the penalty for harboring another man's thrall costs dearly, because ownership depends on everyone agreeing to see it. The people taken learned, quickly, how the calendar of humiliation worked. A thrall could not give testimony in some assemblies. If he was killed, the compensation was less, or sometimes none, because the law declared that a person who belonged to someone else cost less to break. The soul, in such a world, has a weight, and for the prisoner that weight was measured out by someone else's hand. Imagine the journey, not in miles, but in small erasures. Your name becomes difficult for your captor to pronounce, so he changes it to something his tongue likes. You stop trying to correct him, because each correction invites the back of a hand. You speak your prayers softly, because the men around you laugh, or worse, they don't care. The bread tastes of someone else's oven. The water tastes of someone else's well. You learn the rules. Don't look too long at a free woman. Don't speak when men are speaking. Don't ask for more. And you learn that the promise of manumission, of freedom, is a tether, sometimes offered, sometimes jerked away to make you walk farther. It's not as dramatic as an axe, but it's 1,000 cuts deep enough to drown in. And yet, not all chains were the same weight. There were prisoners who were treated with a rough kind of honor, because their value lay in the idea that they could buy their own lives back. A captured earl might be fed well, matched at board games with his captor, given a blanket against the nightly cold. He would be prodded into sending letters home, using messengers who moved along coasts like shadows. He might be permitted, even encouraged, to witness the cruelty shown to lesser captives, so he would understand the terms. The Vikings were not monsters because they enjoyed suffering for its own sake. They were practical men who enjoyed what suffering could buy. And in that calculation lies a chilling kind of intelligence. There were times, too, when the violence done to prisoners was made to be seen beyond the walls of a mead hall or the pages of a saga. After a raid, bodies could be nailed to church doors like grotesque blessings, or they might be arranged along a road to a river ford, a row of stakes that said with brutal economy, "This crossing belongs to us now." In forest groves, ropes creaked in the wind, where men had been hung, not hastily, but ceremonially, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. We have spoken. In one saga, after a battle, the defeated were set along a field with their hands bound across the stocks and their backs opened with whips, until the ground took the same color as their cloaks. Not all those stories are true, and some of them are truer in the telling than in the fact. But the point of telling them was not accuracy. It was instruction. It was the way a community learned by rumor what kind of world it lived in. There is a temptation to separate war from home, to imagine that the cruelty a man learned abroad was shed at the threshold of his farm, like a cloak he could shake off. But in the North, captivity threaded through home life too. At the legal assemblies, the things where free men gathered to argue and judge, the presence of the unfree was a kind of background hum. A free man could bring a thrall to witness his strength, to hold his horse, to be punished in his stead for a small offense, because the law let him. At funerals, goods were placed with the dead, and sometimes, across the Viking and Russ worlds, there is evidence that people were sent along as well. The Arab writer Ibn Fadlan describes a funeral by the Volga, where a slave girl was killed to accompany her master into the next life, a ritual stage-managed by old women who knew precisely how to turn a life into a tool for someone else's eternity. Was that scene common in the Scandinavian homelands? We cannot say. But we can say that the idea of people as something you could keep, spend, even sacrifice, was woven into the age. If you listen carefully to the quieter parts of the sagas, where a thrall goes to fetch water, or a captured woman cares for a child who is both hers and not hers, you hear an ache that is not always front and center, but is always there. It is the ache of a person who lives at the edge of a hearth, warm enough to work, cold enough to remember daily that the fire is not hers. It is easy, from 1,000 years away, to drown that ache in the noise of battles and kings. But the Vikings did not build their world on victories alone. They built it on backs. Of course, when people speak of Viking cruelty, one word cuts through the rest like a blade: blood eagle. It is the legend that refuses to lie down and be explained away. A king of Northumbria, they say, was laid out and opened by Ragnar's sons in such a way that his last breath sounded like a bird freeing itself from a cage of ribs. Scholars argue, surgeons wince, enthusiasts nod solemnly by the glow of a campfire, while the wind fingers the pines. Did it happen? Could it have happened? And more important for our story, what work did such a tale do in the minds of those who might one day suffer Viking hands? Whether or not the knife slid where the saga says it did, the idea of it was a chain of its own. Before we open that cage and peer into the darkness of ritual pain, we need to understand one more thing about prisoners in this world. The Vikings weren't just making examples out of individual bodies. They were architecting fear, making it portable, making it communicable. An Anglo-Saxon farmer who heard that a neighboring village had its share of captives mutilated didn't need to know the details to start bargaining with himself. How much would he give next time to make sure the boats passed his shore in silence? How quickly would he bend? How quickly would he betray to keep his daughter invisible? Fear, conjured, packaged, deployed, was a tool as sophisticated as any shipwright's plane. And yet, even as we talk about tools, about systems and markets and laws, we have to hold on to the faces. The men kneeling in a field with bindings that cut into their wrists and turn their hands purple. The women walking through a market in Dublin who stare straight ahead because to make eye contact is to be noticed, and to be noticed is to be chosen, and to be chosen is to be unmade in 100 different ways. The teenage boy who is told, in a language he does not understand, that he will be called by a new name from now on, and who repeats it out loud, tasting it, because it is the only name he is allowed to keep. That's the part you can't categorize, the part that turns the familiar story of raids into something heavier. The knowledge that the Vikings turned other people's lives into messages, and that those messages were loud enough to echo for centuries. If the axe bite was a letter, the captive's suffering was the paper on which the message was written. And soon, in the next breath of our story, we step from the market and the law into the chamber where men turned suffering into spectacle, where poetry and pain were braided together so tightly that even 1,000 years cannot pull them apart. There, in the twilight between history and legend, a prisoner is stretched, a rib cage is named, and the North holds its breath to see what a body can be made to say. They understood that terror didn't have to be loud. It had to be legible. After the bargaining and the sorting, after the iron collars and the counting of dirhams, there was the other half of the economy. Scenes designed to travel farther than a ship ever could. You see it if you imagine a gray morning on a foreign shore. The boats sit quiet on the tide. A knot of villagers, roped and hollow-eyed, are kept together in the same cold calm as a cargo. One is brought forward, not the weakest. He's marked out not for sale, but for message. A blade is drawn, slow and theatrical, and something small but unforgettable is taken. A strip of hair, a finger, the tip of a nose. The man is pushed to the sand and unbound. He's not killed. He's pointed home. It's a kind of letter written in flesh. He runs, stumbling, and there will be blood and sobbing on the other side, and the terms will be heard. Pay, swear, don't call for help from men who won't come. That one maimed man becomes a mouthpiece that shouts into places where the raiders are not. This is how a wound is made to bleed at a distance. And on another coast, in another century, someone will remember what happened to him and open a coffer before the sails appear at all. The machinery could be grand too. When the Great Army came into Anglo-Saxon England in the 860s, its leaders understood the stage of kingship and sainthood. The story of Edmund of East Anglia, bound to a tree, made into a hedgehog of arrows, beheaded while he called on Christ, is not a neutral account. It's propaganda twice over. Abbo of Fleury wrote it long after, for a cult that needed a martyr to console the living. But the seed of the episode is a performance created by conquerors who were not afraid to make a symbol out of a king. Kill him privately, and you have a victory. Kill him publicly, and you have a sermon every church will preach for you. Even when the words are sharpened by the other side, the shape of the fear is useful. Resist, and you become a legend. Submit, and you stay ordinary and alive. In their own language, in their own cosmology, the Vikings had a grammar for this. The gallows and the spear belonged to Odin, the god who hanged himself for knowledge and drank poetry out of blood. Hangings in sacred groves, described by an outsider like Adam of Bremen with a shudder, contested by modern skeptics who see exaggeration in a missionary's pen, fit too neatly to dismiss outright. The grove itself is a theater. A line of bodies in winter, birds worrying at them, is a sign both to the living and to the gods. Whether a captured enemy was truly given to Odin in a rite every 9 years as Adam insisted, or whether those rites were smaller and scattered, the effect for anyone who saw or heard was the same. These men do not fear our God, and their God eats men. There are quieter offerings. Bones sunk into bogs, bodies pinned under cairns with strange tools beside them, hints that some deaths had a liturgical shape. Up on a hill, above a market town, an oak is black with soot from a cooking fire that doesn't quite fit a feast. At its foot, a ring bolt is hammered into a stone. Think of a captive kept there through a winter night, told what he is now for. A vow to fix a bad harvest, to lift a curse. The men who hold the rope are practical in the same way they were at the counting table. Death is turned into a contract. If the gods listen, they get credit. If the people listen, they get fearful. Public humiliation, too, is a ritual. When the raiders drag a priest by his vestments across his own churchyard, tearing his robe and stripping it of meaning thread by thread, that is theater. When they nail a dead body to a church door, yes, it's reported. Yes, it is the sort of thing a furious monk might paint in words to make righteous anger. What matters in the doing is not the accuracy of every nail. It's the desecration of the threshold. The place you enter to be made clean is turned into a board for meat. That picture paints itself onto everyone nearby. It travels with merchants and with skaldic verses, with frightened boys who go to serve as household guards in ports across the sea and tell what they remember at night. Fear can be portable because meaning is portable. A horse's head on a pole at a harbor, the mouth carved open to display its teeth at a monastery across the water, is not random cruelty. It is a curse. The nidstang, shame pole, appears in saga literature as a way to make an enemy less than a man. Put it facing a hall, or a farm, or a church, and you declare its people unclean, unlucky, soft. You're not killing them. You're arranging the air around them so everyone who's watching knows where to step. In a world where masculinity and honor are currencies, that's worse than a cut, because the wound stays visible until you pay to make it go away. On the ships, the stage is all wood and wind. Prows are carved into beasts. Sometimes their heads are taken off to avoid frightening the land spirits of a friendly shore, but that is the same grammar. The head goes on, the head comes off. Every choice says something about your intention. What hangs from the mast says something too, when the intention is to take. Heads on spikes are old as war, but a head tied into the rigging is a moving billboard, swinging above the water for watchers on the cliffs. Rope is cheap. News is free. You don't have to speak the language of the next island if you can send your meaning to drift along its entire coastline. The markets learn to incorporate the show. In Dublin's long street of stalls, iron rings clack on the necks of boys from Wales, girls from Pictland, a clerk from York who can count and is going to sell well because he can count. Branding irons exist by necessity. Mark what's yours so you can prove it. But the brand is also script. It says someone cared enough to hurt this person in a way that will last longer than the hurt. Sometimes the sign was an owner's mark. Sometimes it was a message to everyone else. This one belongs. Don't interfere. And then, unpredictably, in the same place, with the same crowd, a man might be freed. His freedom is not mercy. It is part of the script. A lord announces the manumission at the same morning meeting where weights are checked, and everyone hears that this thrall will owe a lifelong debt. If he runs, his brand says where to bring him back. If he stays, he is proof that clemency is also a tool. And maybe, just maybe, you should not resist next time, because sometimes resistance is met with release. Information moved in verses. Skalds, court poets with long memories and quick tongues, composed praise that did not shy away from gore. They would stand in halls and declaim how a sea king fed eagles on English fields, how he carved an eagle on a king's back. It is in that last phrase that we meet the blood eagle, and we feel the chill of a story that works even if it isn't true. A skald named Sigvadr Thordarson, praising a later king, seems to reference Ivar, performing an eagle on King Ella of Northumbria. The line is compact, powerful, and vexing. Does carving an eagle mean literally cutting a ribcage open and pulling out lungs to make wings? Or is it the older poetic way of saying men were killed so birds could feast? Bad translations and eager credulity turn a metaphor into a method. Later prose sagas lean into the gore. Orkneyinga saga says Torf Einar did it to Halfdan Longleg. Other late texts add details. The spine split, lungs spread that read more like horror literature than anatomy. But listen to the effect, not the argument. By the time a monk copies that line into Latin, and a storyteller repeats it by a winter fire, The point is the same. The Vikings have a right for your back. Whether their knives ever trace that pattern on a living man, the fear of it could travel on a whisper, faster than a fleet could row. It became a coin of the same power as silver, spent in the moment before a town decides to shut its gates or open them. There are Muslim riders too, standing on riverbanks in the east, watching the Rus, Scandinavian men who came down the great rivers to trade and take, bury their dead with rituals we would rather look away from. Ibn Fadlan, an ambassador on the Volga in the 10th century, describes a dead chieftain set up in a boat, and a slave girl who volunteers, pressured, prepared, intoxicated, cut and strangled, lifted over a lintel into the ship to lie beside him. The moment is ritualized to the last breath, with drums and the old woman he calls the Angel of Death, with men who believe they are enacting something necessary and cosmic. If that is the care given to a beloved leader, consider what less care is given to an enemy. Consider what the retelling of this scene does in markets 1,000 miles away, where a monk hears it and says, "This is what they do to all of us," and a trader hears it and decides not to argue over the price of a human being. Psychological war hums under the obvious violence. It's in the way a Viking band will stop within sight of a settlement and light fires big enough to be seen, to suggest a number larger than they have. It's in the deliberate leaving of a pathway out for a garrison to flee. If they run, the raiders get an easy plunder. If they stay, they know they chose to be trapped. It's in the rumor that someone in the next river mouth paid and slept, and the same men walked past them without looking. And perhaps that rumor is planted by the same ship captain who will arrive here next year to hear your answer. Sometimes the scene is not a kill, but a keeping. Hostages are leverage turned into living clocks. A son of a town reeve, the sister of an abbot, kept not because they're useful as workers, but because they measure the time you have left to send silver. Their treatment is a message calibrated for maximum spread. Feed them enough to keep them alive and bruised. Let them be seen washing clothes on a deck by a fisherman from your town. Let the fisherman row home with what he saw scratched on his face. If the silver comes, release them with care, contradicting the rumors of flaying. If it doesn't, send them home in a sack. Either way, your next target will know the story before you can see their chimneys. The unsteady line between fact and performance is where the worst possibilities grow. A chronicle from the Frankish world might report the raiders hanging captives in a sacred grove, or throwing them to dogs, or cutting off hands. A law code from Norway sets fines for hamstringing and nose-cutting, which means people did it. The sagas, written down late, relish in describing humiliation, beard-cutting, shaving a man's head to make him a laughingstock, dragging a queen by her hair, because these things scar a life more deeply than a wound that will heal. And while you sit in a hut miles inland, you don't have to know which line of which book is fair and which is spiteful. You only have to know that anyone who comes out of the north can make a scene out of your body, and that the scene will be described again and again in places you will never see. Watch how the fear brings money into motion. Paris in 845, and again in 885-886, pays, because it has learned how expensive a spectacle can be. Along the Seine, monks write letters begging the king to send men and silver before the boats bend around their bend. On the Humber, the city that saw heads atop their own walls decides not to see them again. Danegeld, money paid for peace, sounds like a tax, but it is a subscription to not watch a play. The Vikings sell you the absence of theater. If you refuse to subscribe, you get a front row seat. This is why stories like the Blood Eagle earn their keep. They hover at the edge of what might have been done, electrifying the choice in front of a lord with a narrow purse and a frightened household. Even those who never set a rib inside a rib think with that story. Function matters more than forensic truth. The idea can live entirely in language and still make decisions change course. And yet, if we are going to talk about what Vikings did to prisoners and not flinch, we owe it to the dead and to the living to climb as close to the truth as the sources and the bones allow. Did anyone ever lay a living man on his belly and open his back in the way later writers so lovingly describe? Are we dealing with a monster made of misunderstandings, or with a small, terrible practice inflated into a legend? The sagas are late. The skaldic verses are earlier, but they speak in kennings and riddles. Christian writers had reasons to sharpen the horns on their enemies. Archaeology is quiet on this. Wounds on bone can tell some stories, but lungs do not leave their mark for us to see. We will go there. We will take the word eagle in our hands and examine its feathers. We will see where the poetry ends and the blood begins. We will acknowledge what terror does even when a knife stays sheathed, and what knives did even when no poem was written. Because fear in their world and ours is always a tool someone can pick up. But before we pull at that knot, hold the scene on that gray morning. A single man stumbling inland with a hand pressed to his face. A ship quiet on the tide behind him. A group of raiders who haven't raised their voices once. Somewhere in the next valley, a father is already counting up what he can sell. Somewhere farther still, a skald is choosing a word for what will happen here. And somewhere in between, the space where news travels, a legend is stretching its wings. In the next part, we'll follow it into the air and ask, with all the patience the question deserves, when people said the Vikings carved an eagle on a man's back, what did they mean? And what did that meaning buy? The first thing that goes is the shirt. Cloth torn, the back bared to wind and eyes, the blades of the shoulders lifted like shallow hills. The men around him fall silent in that way silence falls, when words have already been spent, when the message will be made with a knife. Someone spits into the dirt. Someone else, a boy, pretends to look anywhere but at the skin he will never forget. The air smells like iron. Whether what happens next ever really happened this way is another question. What mattered then and long after was that people believed it did. Carving an eagle, the phrase threads through our sources like a glint of steel under leaves. It appears first not as a pageant of gore, but as a line in a verse. Skaldic poetry, dense and coded, the kind of speech where an eagle is a stand-in for battle, for death, for what comes to tear at the fallen. 1,000 kennings build a world where a ship is a horse that drinks the sea, a king is a tree feeding wolves, and to let the eagle glide means to let men die. In that language, a poet boasts that an enemy had an eagle carved on his back. In shorthand, only fighters share, that a man was marked for the birds. Centuries later, scribes in Iceland write sagas that retrofit the riddle into a ritual. In Orkney, they tell it of Torf Einar and Halfdan Longleg. The defeated man laid prone, the blades nimble at his ribs, and the lungs pulled out and spread like wings. Over in Northumbria, the sons of a legendary raider take their time with King Ella of York, and the same grim choreography plays out with vengeance as its script. A few even sprinkle salt in the story. Literally, salt in the wound as a flourish the poet would have appreciated. But the manuscript pages are separated from the events they describe by distances you can measure, not just in years, but in purposes. Sagas were entertainment as much as record, and they were composed in a Christian world remembering a heathen one. Listen closely to how the phrases shift over time. Early, it is spare, to cut or to carve an eagle on a back. Later, it is theatrical, to break ribs at the spine, to draw the lungs out like wings. This inflation happens with other tales too, in other cultures. A compact allusion flowers into a morality tale once the audience changes, once the fear or pride the tale serves must swell to fill a new room. The Vikings themselves knew how words grow teeth with retelling. Their poets spoke to kings because a well-placed half-truth can do more work than a spear. So what did it mean in the years when longboats slid into the rivers like knives into seams? To those who spoke in eagles and ravens and whales, it likely meant this. A foe was cut so badly in the back, executed probably, or butchered after death, that birds of carrion could take him quickly. To carve the eagle on him was to make of his back a feast. It was not a specific surgical program, but a symbol with an edge. There are bones that might tell us if ribs were ever split and peeled like pages. They do not sing that song. Archaeologists have sifted the soil at Repton, at Ridgeway, in York, across Orkney's Wynd, and pulled up skeletons laid in mass and singly, hacked, beheaded, slashed, burned. The patterns line up with what war and beheading do to bodies. Notched vertebrae at the neck where blades struck, metacarpals broken in defense, long bones scored. If men took the time to shear ribs from the spine in ritual numbers, to expose lungs and leave them open to air, That violence would inscribe itself in cut marks on the backs of bones. We do not have them. Which is not to prove it never happened, only to notice what the ground will and will not tell you when you press your ear to it. There is also the matter of time and place. Picture the chaos swarming a raid. Sails down, shouts, doors kicked, the crush of bodies pushed toward the shore or the church, or into the pen of the central green. Picture what a raiding party has the bandwidth to do. Their economy is minutes, their leverage is speed. The cruelty they choose must be legible quickly and should travel without them. A slow, messy, expert performance is a luxury they usually cannot afford. They prefer to leave men with eyes gone and noses split, or collars locked, or a head impaled on an oar to watch the tide. They prefer to ferry the living value off the beach before the levees form. The path of least horror for them is rarely the path of least horror for those they take. But then picture something else. A quiet day after a battle. A captured leader whose name will carry. Not a village, not a monastery. A headland where the wind is a spectator and a ship waits below. In those gaps between campaigns and commerce, the calculus shifts. You are a jarl with a message to send to a king. You are a son whose father's tale needs its punctuation mark. In those rare charged contexts, the urge to make a story might push a hand to make a shape. And if the lungs do not flutter convincingly like wings in the cold, and the blood is not as eloquent as the poet would have it, that is what the poet is for. Even then, what matters is not the reality of a few particular deaths, but the rumor that a certain death is possible. The rumor is portable. It is efficient. It travels on boats and in prayers. Monks will write it down in shock and anger, and jarls will let it leak on purpose. In Dublin and Hedeby markets, buyers and sellers weigh captives by age, skill, and susceptibility. Above the stalls, fear is another currency changing hands. When a crew arrives to negotiate Danegeld, it is useful if the town's priest has told his parishioners that there is a way of dying that ends with your heart spread to the sky. It is useful if mothers have told their children to hush, lest the eaglemen come. If rival chieftains hesitate before ambushing you, because they rehearse in their minds what their backs would feel like opened. Open a law book from Iceland, and you can watch words do this other kind of work. Gragas, gray as a winter sky, lists fines and feuds, the price of a tooth and a thumb and a cow and the offense of calling a man arger, unmanly. It does not instruct you in how to perform an eagle. It shows you instead the scaffolding of a world where humiliation and compensation keep order better than spectacle. Thralls have their lanes, the freemen their assemblies. In that lattice, casting somebody outside the human ring, the neath, the pole with its horse head, the carved curses, you wreck them worse than by cutting flesh. You mark them as meat for wolves. And yet the rites to Odin stand at the edge of all this, like a thorn in the cloak. Hangings in droves, spear wounds to give the slain to the one-eyed. These things are attested enough to make scholars speak in tighter sentences. Ibn Fadlan's Volga funeral reads like the description of a play whose actors can command pain with dignity. The slave girl who smiles before her lums forget, the men who carry her in a dance of knives. You realize that when the Norse wanted to do ritual, they could. When they wanted to make killing feel like speech, they had grammars for it. The blood eagle may be one more grammar that existed mostly as a threat, the way a god can exist mostly as a song. Consider the function of the story of King Ella. Anglo-Saxon annals list his fall in sober chainmail, a thing that happened badly on a field with men whose names are lost. The later sagas make him a canvas. They set him on a slab and make him pay for the snake pit that a different story says swallowed Ragnar. It loops. It is symmetrical. In a time before courts that reached past a village, symmetry is sweet justice. Because what else can you aim for? If you can make your enemy's back into a bird where once he made your father's chest into a snake's home, then perhaps the sea will be level again. Or perhaps you just need the world to hear you had the last word. Think too about how skalds got paid. They stood in halls lit by tallow and smoke and recited love letters to your violence. A good line could earn gold from a king's wrist, a ring burst paid in gratitude for a stanza that will braid your name into a future. When a poet cleverly says, "We carved the eagle on Ella," He means we unmade him unforgettably. He also means, remember to pay me. He likely does not mean, I was there with a bone saw. Later, when ink comes instead of ale, and a monk's thin face bends over calfskin in a scriptorium, he may copy a stranger's poem without catching the code. The eagle becomes literal. You can almost hear the scrape of the quill turning a boast into an operation. None of that saved the men and women for whom the rumor was enough. In a village on the Irish coast, a smith with filings black under his nails lays down his hammer and looks at the horizon for sails. He has heard the story in two versions. In one, they will take his daughter to Cork and from there to some place only told in coin names. In the other, if he runs and they catch him, they will cut him like a bird. He does not know which is braver, to step forward and throw his body onto the scale where ransom happens, or to hide, or to fight, or to wait. He chooses. The saga does not name him. The rumor moves on. There are other recorded cruelties easier to prove because they survive in law, in bones, in light. A blinded man stumbles into the doorway of a church whose silver is already gone. A priest turned out to sea on a skiff with his hands bound, an exemplary mercy if he floats to shore, an exemplary warning if he does not. A handful of boys marked with collars that silence their names into owners' names. A woman cut on the face to fix her in her class. We know these because they were repeatable. They were tools, not signatures. The blood eagle, if it ever breathed, was a signature nobody wanted to practice often. You reserve the most expensive letter of your alphabet for the times you must sign loud. It is also useful to watch how enemies borrow and reflect each other's menace. The Byzantines in their manuals coolly describe hamstringing prisoners to prevent revolt. Carolingian capitularies threaten hanging, castration, blinding. Irish kings take hostages and maim by law, a phrase that could be a skaldic kenning if it weren't so bureaucratic. Vikings wrote their letters of terror into this same mail. What distinguished them was not that they invented horror, but that they learned so quickly what rulers kept coins flowing without unsheathing swords. By the time Christianity roots deep in Scandinavia, the story of the eagle has a new job. It is no longer a brag, it's a sermon. Martyrs need their devils. Priests stand up and stone churches men like Einar never saw, and point to pages where pagans act like animals so that their saints can be better lambs. In that turn, the faces of the actual captives slip further away. The girls who lived and the men who carried water and the children born into the half-light of servitude cannot compete, narratively, with eagles on backs. They are a different kind of message, patient, plain, and unadorned, and yet if you tilt your ear, you can still hear the footfall of the practical at the edge of the flamboyant. The man with the knife in the story has used it to cut rope and meat and brush all week. He knows what edges do and don't do. He knows what it would take to unhouse ribs from a spine, how the blade would stick or skate. He may have done it to deer. He may have watched a woman do it better. He may tire of the way talkers talk. If he once did carve an eagle on a lord's back, the thing he remembered later at the fire was not poetry. It was the way hot blood met cold air, and how the men drew back or leaned closer, and whether it changed the rate at which the world paid him what he asked. Was it done? The only honest answer is unsatisfying. It may have been done, rarely. It was certainly said. It was said so loudly, across so many winters, that men changed their choices because of it. The rumor became a weapon sharper than the knife it described. When your business model relies on other people's decisions to run instead of resist, there is no better advertisement than a story that settles into their sleep and wakes them when the oars creak in the bay. There is a last turn to make before we leave the cliff where we cannot stop staring at the wind's idea of wings. Ask what the story bought. What did men gain by threatening to make other men's backs into birds? Sometimes the price of a town. Sometimes the peace to winter your ships without sending a man to the grave. Sometimes the reverence of enemies, which is to say the stability to trade with them later. Sometimes only that sweet, symmetrical wash of justice that makes you breathe easier after grief. All of those are victories a farmer could count. But if we let the camera keep rolling, it leaves the headland and wanders inland to the low doorways where the people taken alive had to bend to enter. We have been standing with violence at its loudest, when it wants as many eyes as possible. Now go where eyes soften, concentrate on tasks, bruise, adjust. Go into longhouses, where a woman captured at Lindisfarne 10 winters ago is dyeing thread the color of summer plants. Her name is not used in the room. She is called by the work she does. A boy who was a hostage 3 years, whose ear is nicked by a reminder of his value, grinds grain by rote, and dreams of a river he can no longer truly remember. A craftsman kidnapped from Frisia fits a hinge to a chest and improves a household that will never be his. These are the lives the Eagle stories did not need. These are the faces cropped out of fear's advertisement. They are also the engine that made the terror profitable. Bodies transformed into labor, intimacy arranged by force, a daily discipline that did not require grand theater to be degrading. If you want to understand what Vikings did to prisoners, it cannot end on a cliff with a knife. It goes on down the path, into rooms where night after night the person is trimmed into a thing the owner can use. And so away from the high windy ledges and the codex margins where eagles perch, we step over a threshold where the cruel efficiency we traced at Lindisfarne settles into routine. There is a different kind of theater here, quiet and closing, performed in linen and ash rather than in blood. What did the days taste like? How did love and language warp under collar and command? What bargains did the taken make in order to stay themselves? The next time we sit together, it is not with a king tied down in vengeance. It is with the invisible majority, the men and women who did not die, who learned the weight of keys and the grammar of orders, and who, even inside ownership, found ways to alter the story being told about them. Before dawn, the longhouse is a single breath held in wood and smoke. You wake on straw by the door, where the drafts slip in, where the dogs sleep, and the snow heaves itself in drifts under the eaves. You lift your head and wait for permission to move. The great room is a spine of fire, embers winking along the central hearth, and already someone, one of the household's daughters, has slid feet into fur and stirred the coals to life. Your old name doesn't reach you here. There is a grunt, a gesture, and you roll to your knees. The collar tugs when you stand, because the tether line was looped over the post while you slept. No one needs to speak. The day starts with the grinding. The cornstone is a hard moon at your feet. Your hands are new to it, and already older than they were. The upper stone bouts at the lower as you push it round and round with the wooden handle, barley and rye becoming grit and then meal under your palms. Before the house wakes, you feed the house. More than anything, the rhythm is what they own. Turn, dip, sweep, push, lift, scatter. The mistress of the farm passes once, twice, 3 times with buckets. You do not look into her face, and she doesn't look into yours. Her children run past with puffed winter cheeks and stop to stare because they have never known you with a different name. This is the quiet theater of ownership the raiders were paid to stage far away. A body captured on a coast becomes a body that pours beer and spins flax, that pulls fish from lines and carries the third of the logs when the men bring home timber. An iron ring on a lintel is a solution to a problem, just as a manacle buried in a harbor mudflat is a fossilized receipt. The fear that ran before you down the river has turned into a collar and a ration and a place to sleep. In that transformation is the profit that mattered. It is tempting to imagine that terror is always loud. The sagas and the annals give us those images. Banners pitched in the mud, men staked and cut, saints with arrows in the skin. But terror also wears a homespun cloak and a rope belt. It sits at the far stool when the stew pots are ladled and waits, last in line, because the law says you are not a person who can speak at the assembly, and your master is fined if you are murdered, not because you are owed blood price, but because he lost property. Gulathing and Gragas write this in a cool hand. A thrall may not bear witness. A thrall's child is a thrall if the mother is. The man who hides another man's thrall pays. If a runaway is found, he can be beaten. If a thrall kills a free person, he dies, and the master settles the debt. These are rules written not to rage, but to manage, and they tell us how wide the pen was. Because the pen was wide enough that resistance had to be folded into it. Small acts became a vocabulary. A handful of grain skimmed into your sleeve. The knife dulled on purpose. A word taught to a child in the old tongue while you spin. A daughter of the house who thinks you cannot understand her laughter, and then discovers months later, a year later, that you always could. There are sagas where this silence is everything. Melkorka, bought as a thrall because she is mute and docile, who one night speaks in clear Gaelic and says she is a king's daughter from the west. The rich widow who purchased her, Unner, keeps her anyway at first. A voice cannot buy you out of the net. Later, manumitted Melkorka becomes a mother to a future chieftain, her son Olafur, belly full of two worlds. That is one survival, the elegant one that stories prefer. Most did not end with the unlocking of the iron and the giving of a gift name at the church door, because that door could be a door to a longer bondage. Manumission was a bargain. The new name came with a string on it. As a Lasingi, a freed person, you owed your former household years of work and gifts. Your status only a shade lighter than what it was. Your honor price a ledger's half number at the law court. Men freed turn up on runestones as kinsmen of the men who owned them, because the fiction of family made the world more polite. It also made labor easier to claim. A freedman could still have his bones buried at the low end of the churchyard. We know this, not just because saga authors like the dramatic convenience of reversals, but because the bones speak. There are graves across Sweden and Denmark, whose teeth grew on other soils. Strontium and oxygen tell on the dead. The women in certain Viking farm cemeteries ate different childhood bread and drank from different rivers before they lay down under unfamiliar earth. They are buried with brooches like the local ones, yes, because in death everyone is given their place. But their skeletons carry the unglamorous signs of ground-in labor and healed breaks and the angled wear of baskets carried for decades. They died as insiders. They did not start as insiders. That transformation, the erasure of names and the slow grafting of bodies into the woodwork of the North, was possible because the Vikings were precise about where fear becomes a contract. Ransoms demand that you leave a space in your enemy's house for a ghost to return. Domestic captivity demands that you teach that ghost to milk. Both required performance. The Danegelds forced out of English towns were public theater. Weigh the silver in front of everybody. Let the townsmen feel their honor push down the scale. Inside the longhouse, humiliation was less ceremonial and more constant. You stand when the house eats. If you are a woman, you share the bed not by deep devotion, but by a calculation of assets. Your children born as wealth. There is a law phrase for this, as bloodless as a snowfield. Frilla, the woman who is a man's other. There are no obligations of marriage to shield you. There is only the arithmetic of milk and mouths, of labor counted in spindles and birks. This arithmetic is not only Scandinavian. It is a Baltic and Slavic and Frankish sum. Go east with the Rus along the Volga, and Ibn Fadlan watches men dock longships on black rivers. Watches pale traders sell beaver and boys to Volga Bulgars. Notes how they mourn their dead with choreographed violence, yes, but more importantly, he notes the exchange rates. Silver dirhams, stamped with Kufic script, pour north like moonlight skimmed off far dunes. Those coins end their lives around farm hearths, where thralls turn querns, in mounds where iron neck rings and child-sized manacles are folded as offerings. Go west to Dublin and you find a town grown fat on human freight, ruled by sea kings whose annals measure their success in great praise taken from Meath and Munster. The Irish monasteries mark seasons by the sale of their cousins. And captivity's dramas were not only the masters to stage. There is a story at the beginning of Iceland that tells you exactly how thin the line was between terror performed and terror answered. Two settlers, kinsmen, flee Norway and build homes on the edge of a new world. One of them, Hjorleifr, is said to have mistreated his Irish slaves, worked them past any agreement, pressed them like nails into timber. While the other, Ingolfr, is away, the Irish kill Hjorleifr and his men, take what they can carry, and run to a knot of islands off the south coast. Ingolfr returns, follows them, traps them on the Black Cliffs, and kills them one by one. The islands have a name ever since, the Westman Islets, for the western men who died there. It is a story told in Landnámabók, half settlement ledger and half myth, and it is a story that the land itself holds, basalt and surf and the sound of a chase. For a moment, the thralls did not turn the millstone. They turned the story over. For a moment, their fear bought them a sword's length of sky. Push in closer. The room in the longhouse where you sleep is also the room where you are punished, where your hair can be cut short to mark you out, where the scars will be placed, where sleeves do not hide them. Travelers noticed what humiliation looked like at a human scale. An Arab geographer mocked the Rus for washing in a shared bowl and trampling the boundaries of decency. A Frankish monk wrote about collars heavy as shame. Sometimes, even in Scandinavia, the theater tipped towards spectacle, because spectacle made the law real. A knee pole raise, meaning you are outside the community. A dead horse's head hoisted to mock and curse. If a thrall ran and was caught, the iron returned to the neck in full view. You needed the neighbors to see your order at work so it could reflect back on them. But there is a disquieting sophistication in how quickly the North learned to domesticate its terror. Violence at the shoreline had a season. The harvest had its own. When kings began to pull together their polities, they did not abolish enslavement. They harnessed it to tax and tithe. Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson preached and cut, baptized and burned, being saints and warlords by turns. New laws arrived with crosses carved into their heads. Do not sell Christians, said the pious, not because selling people was wrong, but because these people now wore the sign. The market did not close, it rerouted. A captive baptized at a church plank might climb a rung he could not before, because new stories, like setting servants free for the sake of the soul, began to matter. The ledgers shifted, bit by bit, and yet in the sagas written after, the language of thrall persisted as metaphor. To be in thrall becomes to be held by love or envy, or a song itself. They could not write the word without tasting the iron. Out of this iron, families are made. Iceland's DNA hedge tells a harsh, clear truth. Many of the maternal lines on that island are Irish and Scottish. The founders were a Viking mixtape, Norsemen and Gaelic women, some free, some captured, some rebranded as wives, some never named in the books. The Westman story runs alongside the story of Melkorka. Resistance and incorporation braided like the house timbers. When we lean down to the stones, we hear voices in two tongues where there was once only wind. Step back again and look at the arc. At the beginning, fear is freight. A raiding ship moves up an estuary like a knife along the fat of the land. At the end, fear is law. It is written into what a person can be. The Vikings were not the only people to do this, and not the last, but they were exceptionally clear about turning feeling into currency. A rumor bought a gate opened. A gallows delayed bought a chest of silver. A lifetime bought a life made cheaper than iron. They codified the exchange. They put it under a roof and lit a fire and called it normal. And then, slowly, the ground shifted under their feet. Warlords discovered they could extract more from stable farms than from burning towns. The Christian calendars settled over the islands like a new snow whose weight the houses had to learn. Tribute turned into tax. Raids turned into wars, which turned into politics, which turned into courts. Manumission at the church door made new freemen who paid their dues. By the 12th century, the class of thralls thinned in Scandinavia. The cheapness of the Baltic slave supply interrupted by stronger neighbors and stronger kings. A system that had been built to run on bodies ran on different fuels, but it didn't go away. It left fossil phrases and fossil bones and stories that caught at the edges of lantern light. There is one more scene worth holding in the mind, because it says what the worst thing really was. It is not a blood eagle. Whether it existed or not is almost beside the point. It is a woman kneeling at a church threshold because the law says manumission is a threshold act, the literal crossing over. The master places a hand on her head. A priest says words that sound like wings. A coin taps her palm. A new name is spoken. She stands. People smile. It is a good thing. It is mercy. And yet the collar-shaped memory around her neck does not vanish. Her children will not be equal for a while. The household still expects the same pair of hands at the same workbench tomorrow. There will be gifts to give and deference, and the old tongue pressed smaller under the new one. The terror was not only what they could do to your body, but what they could do to a calendar, to your years and your children's years, to the next harvest and the one after that. They could own time. We kept looking for the Viking Age's cruelty in a ritual, in an act that makes you flinch and look away. The sagas and the monks and even the skalds helped us look that way, because spectacle is good poetry and good sermon. But the worst thing was colder. It was the perfection of an idea. That fear, administered carefully, could be banked like silver. That suffering, rationed, could be made to breed new wealth. That the right humiliation, repeated daily under a longhouse roof, could turn strangers into tools and then into kin, and then into history that forgets their names. Perhaps that's why the memory of them is so sticky. Thrall is the word we still use for what takes us over. A ghost of an institution carried forward as metaphor. Dublin is a city grown over the footprint of a market where people were sold. A modern theater built over an old stage. Those iron neck rings dug up in peatlands reappear in museums under glass, which is another kind of prison. The past kept still, owned again by our gaze. The Vikings frighten us because they were efficient at doing what we would rather call aberration, but they knew it as cash flow. And so we return to the longhouse as the night comes down again. The embers soften. The bar above the door is set. The livestock shuffle into their half of the building. The breath of cows and humans mixing under a smoke-dark ceiling. Somewhere in the straw, a child turns and speaks a word he learned from a woman who once had a different name. A word from the West that will survive even if no one remembers whose mouth taught it. On the post near the door, the iron ring gleams. History likes to end things neatly. A battle won, a king baptized, a date in a chronicle. But the plays we do not want to watch never end at the right time. They keep running in the background. Quiet, profitable, hard to see. As the fire goes out, as the season turns, as the boats rot into the mires and the sagas grow elaborate in the retelling, ask yourself, in the hush between the last sentence and sleep, what mattered more, the blade you imagined or the collar you did not? And what if, when the curtain finally fell on this age, the most dangerous part was how satisfying the applause sounded?